Hey everybody! In today's video we're going to walk through creating a React application using TypeScript. The application we're going to make today is a Pokédex using the excellent free Pokemon API. I'm not going to go into the fundamentals of React, so this is more for people that have used React before but would like to see what it looks like in TypeScript. If you haven't used React before, you can still follow along, as most of what we're going to do is pretty straightforward. If you have any questions, leave me a comment and I'll do my best to answer your questions. So let's get started. So first I'm going to create our app. I'm going to use the create React app template. So I'll say yarn create React app. I'm going to call it Pokédex. And then since we want to use TypeScript, we have to add the -- template TypeScript. And then that's going to take a little bit to download the dependencies and create our folder structure. I've heard a lot of people say that they worry that types are going to get in their way and slow them down in their React applications. So today I'm going to try and show you a few tips that I use to make working with types painless. But then we also get to enjoy all the benefits types do provide, like refactoring and error checking before we run, all that good stuff. So the first thing I'm going to do is install tslint so that we can lint our code. And to do that, I'm going to open up a terminal window in VS Code. And then say yarn add tslint. And then I'm also going to add a tslint.json file and use my standard tslint file, which just extends the recommended tslint rules and adds a rule for indentation to be tabs, because that's my preferred indentation. You can use whatever you want. All right. You'll also notice that the test now fails because we got rid of... Why does the test now fail? Oh yeah, that runs there, okay. You also notice that the test now fails because we got rid of the code. So for now, I'm just going to get rid of the code that we don't need. And now it's passing. If you don't have the check mark and X's here when your test passes or succeeds, it's because I have an extension called, the extension is just called Jest. If you install it, you can get the check marks there as you're writing your code. So to start off our Pokédex, the first thing I want to do is create a search bar so that people can type in the name of the Pokemon that they're interested in and get information back. So to do that, I'm going to create a form. And inside the form, I'll have an input element. It's going to have a value. Let's go ahead and give it a placeholder that says search for Pokemon. And then a button so they can submit the form. So nothing new here. This is just standard React. Let's go ahead and create some state for our Pokemon name. So I'm going to do Pokemon name, set Pokemon name, react.use state, and give it a default value of string. So as you can see, we haven't had to do anything new as far as TypeScript is concerned. TypeScript figures out that since we gave it an empty string here, that this type should be a string. And so now, as you can see, Pokemon name is a string, and set Pokemon name expects a string as its argument. So everything's good. So I'll come down here and go ahead and say Pokemon name. So we're going to add an onChange. There's a couple different ways we can do this. The first way, we can come up here and say const handle name change, and then we're going to get an event from the onChange. But TypeScript is gonna want to know what type this is. So if we hover over the onChange, we can come in here and see that the event has a type of react.changeEvent HTML input element. So if I highlight all this, I can copy it, come up here and paste it. And then we have our function, and I can add it down here, and everything works fine. All the types work out. Now that's a little annoying because getting this type, hovering over, copying it, isn't fun. So the way I like to do it, let me delete this. Since I know onChange is going to give us an event, I'll type an event, do an arrow function, and just do an open close. And then I can highlight everything I just did there, and in VS Code hit Control period, and select Extract to Constant Enclosing Scope. Now as you can see, the first thing it wants me to do is give it a name, so I'll say handle name change. But now the great thing is that VS Code has put the type information there for us, so we don't have to go look it up, we don't have to copy and paste, it's just all there. So that's one of my tips for today, to make working with types a little easier. So now, since we have the event and the type, we can just say set Pokemon name event.target.value, and we're good to go. So I haven't started up our development server yet, so that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to open up a terminal window, say yarn start, and it should start up here, and we should get a search bar. All right, so now we can type in whatever Pokemon we're interested in. It also looks like we didn't put any text into our button, so let's go back here and do that now. There we go. Okay, so now we have a form. We can type in, we can search, and the page reloads. So that's not exactly what we want, but we're getting there. So let's go add an action for the form submit. So we'll say on submit. And then I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to say event. Whoops. Extract to constant enclosing scope. And I'm going to call this search for Pokemon. All right. First thing I'm going to do when searching for Pokemon is I'm going to prevent the default because I don't actually want to submit the page and have it reload. Now I want to load some information from this Pokemon API. Now when I'm working with network requests, I prefer to use a library called Axios. Let me go ahead and stop the development server. I'm going to install Axios, and the one thing I also need to do is install the types for Axios so that TypeScript knows what we're talking about. So I'm going to yarn add Axios and at types Axios. Now one thing I like to do when I'm working with APIs is I like to separate all of the API calls out into their own functions. So to do that, I'm going to go up here to the source, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder, call it APIs, and then inside of that, I'm going to create a pokeapi.ts file. So to start with, I'm going to import Axios, and then I'm going to go ahead and set the base URL to the Pokemon base URL, Pokemon API base URL. That way, just when we make requests to the Pokemon API, we don't have to set that part of the URL every single time. Then I'm going to go ahead and create an object called PokeAPI. And this is going to be where I put all my functions for accessing the Pokemon API. First one we want is getting information about a Pokemon, so we'll just call it get Pokemon. It's going to take the name of the Pokemon name of type string. And then we're going to want to go ahead and call the Pokemon API. So I'll say axios.get and then Pokemon/Pokemon name. So now this will call the Pokemon API and getting the information. But since we're using TypeScript here, it's going to want to know what the type that we're going to get back is. So if I go ahead and look at the Pokemon API, I'm going to come down here and say, show me the raw JSON. So here is an example of all the information we're going to get back whenever we get a Pokemon. So now it would be kind of annoying to go through and create an interface for all of this in TypeScript, but that's okay. There's a trick we can do. So I'm going to go ahead and copy all of this JSON and then go back to Visual Studio Code, and then I'm going to use another extension that is called paste JSON as code. So now what this is going to do, it's going to be able to take the JSON that I just copied, and when I paste it in here, it's going to turn it into an interface. Paste JSON as code, and we'll just call the top level a Pokemon. And now, as you can see, it's generated all the interfaces that we need for this type. So we have a Pokemon, and then the abilities inside of the Pokemon, and as you can see, all kinds of stuff. Now you might notice that we have a TSLint warning that says interface names must start with capitalized I. It's the interface name rule. I don't really care about that. I don't want to follow that rule. So I'm going to come in here and add that rule and just turn it off. And now that goes away. So now I can come back up here to my Axios and say that the return type is a Pokemon. So now this is a strongly typed return value. So the one other thing I forgot is to add the actual return in here, so we actually return a value. So if we look, this Pokemon function now returns the type of a promise that is an Axios response with the internal data being Pokemon. So if I go back over here to our application, file, inside of our search here, oh, forgot one more thing. I need to export Poke API so we can actually access it from the other file. So now I can say Poke API, Visual Studio Code automatically imports it for me, and then say get Pokemon and go ahead and pass it the Pokemon name. So now what are we going to do with that information once we get it? Well, for now, let's just make sure that it's actually working. And we will, how about we just display the image of the Pokemon? So if I come down here to sprites, we can get the front default image and we'll put that up there and we'll be happy. So I'm going to go ahead and make this an async function so that I can use async await. Say const response equals await the Pokemon API call, and then inside of the response I'll go to the data and get the sprites and the front default. So now, just for now, I'm going to create another state value. We'll say Pokemon image, set Pokemon image, use state. And then once we get the image, we'll just set the Pokemon image, and then come down here below our form and add an image, the source of Pokemon image. All right, go ahead and save that. Then go back over to our application. Oh. Don't think, yep, I forgot to start our application back up. So we'll say yarn start again. Once it loads, we'll go ahead and search for a Pokemon. Oh, doesn't like something. Okay, so here's a good example of what a TypeScript compilation error looks like in the browser. So as you can see, it says type void is not a valid async function return type in ES5 because it does not refer to a promise compatible constructor value. And it tells us it's on line 13 at the void right there. So if I go back here, you can also see in our console output, it tells us the same thing. If I go back to line 13, this is what it doesn't like. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove that. TypeScript will automatically look at this code and figure out what the return type should be. So it's going to turn it into a promise void, which for now is okay. We just want to see if this is working. So I'll go ahead and save that again, come back over here, compilation error is gone, and if I search for a Pikachu, okay, we got that. If I search for a Snorlax, we get that. Okay, so everything is working so far so good. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to do some refactoring. I feel like we're putting too much stuff into our app component, and we really could break this up into some other components. So I'm going to go back to our directory structure here, and I'm going to create a components directory. And then I'm going to create a search bar .tsx file inside of the components directory. And this is where we're going to create our search bar component. So I'm going to go ahead use a snippet to generate the structure for us. I'll call the name of the component search bar. And in TypeScript, since we have to give all the props a type, we go ahead and create an interface called search bar props. Then that's going to be the structure of our props for this component. For this component, I only need one prop, and that's going to be, let's say, on search. And that's going to be a function that takes the name of the Pokemon as a string and doesn't return anything. And then in our component function, I want to destructure that to make it easier to get to. So I'll just say on search here. And now we're ready to write our component. So I'll go back over to the app.tsx file, and we're going to need our form. I want to put that in the component, so I'm going to return the form. Then we also need the Pokemon name, the handle name change, and the search for Pokemon values. So I'll take the Pokemon name and put it in our component. Take the handle name change, put that in our component. And the search for Pokemon. Now here, I don't actually want to do the search. It's just when somebody wants to search, I'm going to go ahead and call the onSearch callback with the name of the Pokemon. And I'll let somebody else deal with the actual searching. So there's our search bar component. We just took what we had from app and moved it over here. So now going back to our app file, I'm going to add the search bar component in. VS Code auto imports it for me. And then on search, I want to call the search for Pokemon. Except now, instead of taking this event, it's just going to give us the name of the Pokemon as a string. And now I don't need to prevent default because that was already handled. If I go back over to the browser, everything should still work. Search for a Pokemon, I get that. Search for another Pokemon, still get the image, and we're happy. Okay, the next thing I want to do is create a unit test for our new component. So I'm going to go back to components, create a new file. I'm going to call this one searchbar.test.tsx. And here we're going to write a jest unit test to test what we just did. So first, I'll import React. And then I'll also import render from the testing library. And I'm going to import user event also from the testing library. Okay, now let's create a jest test. So I'm going to say test. I'm going to call this can get Pokemon name on submit. Okay, so first thing we need to render our search bar. So I'm going to say const, and I want the get by role function from the render. Search bar, and then I need to give it the on search. This is going to give us a name that we'll do something with here in a second. So I'm just going to create a local variable, call it Pokemon name, set it to the empty string. Whenever on search is called, we're going to set Pokemon name equal to the name we just got. So now we want to simulate typing in the Pokemon we're searching for. So I'm going to use user event.type, get by role, I want the text box, and then I want to type in Pikachu. And now we're going to simulate a button, the button click. So user event click, get by role button. And then after all that happens, I expect that the Pokemon name to be Pikachu. Okay, so now if I save that, we see Jest is running some tests right now, and then in a second, we get the green check mark saying our test passed. So everything's good. If you want to see what a failure looks like, if we just say, I expect it to be Pikachu 1, save that, wait for the Jest test to run, and we get the failure. And we can see here, if we hover over it, we expected Pikachu 1, but we actually just got Pikachu. Okay. Switch that back, save it, so our test pass again. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is change how we display the Pokemon. So to do that, we're going to go up and create a new component. I'm going to call this search result. And we're going to call the component the same thing. So I'm going to call this a search result. And the props it's going to take is just a Pokemon. So to start with, we're just going to copy from what we had over here, which was just the image of the Pokemon. And then in our app, we're just going to reference the search results and give it to the Pokemon, which means we need to change our state. So instead of saving just the Pokemon image, we're going to save the entire Pokemon. And now since we start with no Pokemon, I'm going to change the state type so it can either be a Pokemon or it can be undefined. And we'll start with undefined. Add the reference, and then come down here, and then again, instead of saving the image, we're just going to save the entire Pokemon object, which now means we can pass it into the search result component. As you can see, Typescript is warning us that this is expecting just a Pokemon, and we're giving it a Pokemon or an undefined. So I'll go back into the search result and change this so that it can also be an undefined. And then, again, Typescript is warning us this might be undefined. So if Pokemon equals undefined, I'm just going to return a div that says, or I'll just return an empty fragment, React fragment. So the first thing I'm going to do is just create a container div and give it a little bit of basic styling, nothing too much. This is still going to look pretty bare bones. And then I'll go ahead and okay, so now we'll check that out real quick. So now I'll check that out real quick. Do a search. So now let's go ahead and create a test for this one. So I'm going to create a new file, search result.test.txx, and import all of our usual stuff. And then for my first test, I just want to make sure that the Pokemon's name is showing up. So show Pokemon name. I'm going to use query by text this time. I'm going to render search results, Pokemon, and now I need to give it a Pokemon here, which we'll do in a second. And then once that's done, I expect when I query by text a name in here that it will be in the document. Okay, so now we need to give it a Pokemon here, and instead of actually relying on an API in our unit tests, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back over to the Poke API. And you see when you first pull up the Poke API, it gives you the results for Ditto. So I'm just going to say view this as raw JSON, and I'm going to copy all the results here. And I'll go back over here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder under source called testing. And then under that, I'm going to create another folder called data. And then inside of that, I'm going to create a file called ditto. TypeScript file, just a ditto.tst. And then I'm just going to say export ditto, const ditto equals JSON. So now we don't have to actually hit any APIs, we can just reference this export directly in our tests. So if I come back over here and then Pokemon, say ditto, it's going to auto import it for me. Import ditto, and then down here I'm just going to say ditto.name. And it looks like I left out a comma. So now if we let our just test run, boom, it passes. Okay, so now we know that we have a Pokemon name. So now I'm going to do the same thing, but this time make sure that we have an image. And this time I'm going to query by alt text. And now let's handle the case where, what if there is no Pokemon? So when we first start out, nope. Okay, so now we've tested everything we've done so far. Now let's say we want to handle if somebody searches for a Pokemon name that doesn't exist. So if we just go over here, back to our app, and we search for something that doesn't exist, we want to display something here to show that we couldn't find a Pokemon. So instead of writing the code, I'm going to write a test first. I'm going to say test Pokemon not found. So whenever this happens, I want to query by text. Let me go ahead and just copy this. Say when Pokemon equals null. I want to query and expect there to be something that says no Pokemon found. Okay, so immediately we get TypeScript saying you can't pass null in for Pokemon. So if we go back over here, I'm going to add this to our type definition and say it's okay, Pokemon can be null, which then again TypeScript tells us, well, this can be null, so we should fix that. Here, checking if Pokemon is null, I want to return just a div that says no Pokemon found. Now if I save this and run our test, okay, that passes as well. So now our search result can handle if we pass in a null for a Pokemon. However, our app never actually passes in null for a Pokemon. So how do we handle that? Well, if we go to our API here where we're making this call, if we search for Pokemon that isn't found, this is actually going to throw an exception because we get a 404 back from the API saying not found. So I'll wrap this in a try catch real quick here. Whoops. And then if it does throw, we'll just set Pokemon equal to null. Which again, then TypeScript tells us we have to come up here and add null as an option in the type. So now if we come back over here and we search for something that doesn't exist, we get the text no Pokemon found, exactly what we wanted. Okay, so let's do one more thing with this example here. Let's go back to our search result, and we're gonna just see how we can use another hook, use effect in TypeScript, just to see if it's any different. So for this one, what we're going to do is we're going to get a description of the species and just add it into our search result component here. So to do that, we're going to add the use effect hook. And inside this effect hook, we're just going to make another API call to get the species information. So first, let's go back over to our Poke API. And I'm going to go over to the documentation, version 2, Pokemon species. So here we can see this is what we're going to get back when we make this API call. So again, I'm going to say view the JSON, copy it, and then I'm going to go back to our Poke API file. Just go down to the bottom here, and again, paste JSON as code. And for the top level name, I'm just going to say Pokemon species. So now we have everything that TypeScript needs for the Pokemon species API query. So I'll add this to our Poke API object. Say get Pokemon species. And let's say this takes in a Pokemon, and it's going to return the results from an Axios get, which is a type Pokemon species. And then the URL is pokemonspecies.url. All right, so now back in our search result file, in here, I'm going to create a new async function. Let's call it fetch species. And I'm going to say the response is the result of awaiting Poke API.get Pokemon species of a Pokemon. Again, as you can see, TypeScript warns us this might be null or undefined, which we did not allow in our Pokemon species. So here I'm just going to say, well, if it's not null or undefined, go ahead and call it. And then we want to go ahead and save this in some state so we can use it in our component. So I'll come back and create a species state. And start out with it being undefined. And then we can set the species from the response value. And then since we're depending on the Pokemon prop here, we'll go ahead and add Pokemon just like we would in any other React. Nothing special about TypeScript here. And then go ahead and call fetch species. So now let's go ahead and come down in our component, and we're going to add some information from the species. So we'll say species. I'm going to use the question mark dot operator, which is a new operator just recently added to TypeScript. And I'm going to get the flavor text entries, and then I only want to show English, so I'm going to filter this and say in the language name equals N for English. I just want to get the first one and put it in there. Okay, so now let's go back to our browser, search for Pikachu, and sure enough, now we have a nice little description here about Pikachu. Same thing for Snorlax. And there you have it. Here's a small but functional React application written in TypeScript. I hope you can see that adding TypeScript doesn't add too much overhead, although there is some, but it does give you some nice benefits. As we saw, it enforced us to check to make sure that objects weren't null or undefined, things that you can easily forget when you're normally writing JavaScript code. So what do you think? Do you think you want to try using TypeScript in React? Leave me a comment, let me know.